Welcome, everybody, to another edition of Millennials Are Killing Capitalism Live. We have Dwayne Monroe this morning, or this afternoon, or evening, wherever you are in the world. It's good to be with you. Good to see the chat lively already before we even started. So, we're going to cover a story that I think a lot of people have probably been following for a while, but has picked up some more recent headlines. Sorry, no Wu-Tang hat today now. So we're gonna talk about it. It's something that Dwayne had written about back when the first story came out, the plus 972, which I realize is also, we'll talk about it, but it's a liberal Zionist publication. But um we're gonna get into that story. We'll get into the Guardian story, which the Guardian is a liberal imperialist publication. But nonetheless, these places do reporting, and they have stuff that we can definitely talk about and deepen the analysis that's going on related to them. And Microsoft, as folks remember probably from some previous conversations with Dwayne, is kind of right in Dwayne's wheelhouse in terms of his analysis on technology, and so I'm really looking forward to this. And yeah, make sure to do the things like share the video, get it to more people. Both liking and sharing help more people to see this. Subscribe to the channel if you have not already. um, Monday we have the Imperial 80s. We're going to have A Nightmare on Elm Street, which kicks off with Renee Johnston. Good to see you, Renee. Also, by the way, I'm sorry, I'm all over the place this morning, but if you have not seen Dwayne's episode of Saturdays with Renee this past Saturday, make sure and watch that also, because that's an excellent conversation. Mtume, my co-host from Imperial 80s, was also on that along with Jared Ball and Renee. So that's a really good conversation also. But this is a story that we haven't really talked about in depth. And so I'm looking forward to doing so. So let me introduce our guest real quick. For those who don't know, Dwayne Monroe is a technologist with decades of experience in the US and Europe. He intimately knows how technologies the media describes as ethereal really work, where they come from, and how they're used in the multinational corporations and governments dominating our lives. He applies what he calls a noir Marxist lens, stylistically informed by the work of Raymond Chandler, analytically informed by Marxian materialism, to dissecting the tech industry with a special emphasis on Microsoft's plans and actions. Dwayne has been published in Logic Magazine and The Nation, and maintains a blog, Computational Impacts, which is where one of the pieces that we'll be talking about with him was written. I'll make sure. Oh, I do have that in the show description as well. That's good. Where he writes about the industry's latest moves and how we're affected. He is completing a book on the anti-worker purposes of AI called Attack Mannequins. All right. So without further ado, Dwayne, welcome back. It's good to be with you.
Yeah, hey, it's good to be here.
All right, so let's get started. So why don't we talk about the, kind of summarize what we're going to go into this morning. Folks, I'm sure, have seen some of this reporting. I should say, I guess, because people are being more litigious and weird towards everybody right now, that these are all allegations, I guess, to some extent. There's whistleblowing and this kind of stuff coming out. But this is a long-standing allegation now, and it has, there's been more and more reporting done by outlets that are held to journalistic standards and would be sued also if they printed something libelous and all of that kind of stuff. And so, so what what's the overview before we kind of dig into the weeds a little bit?
In 2024, Plus 972 magazine, which, as you say, is a liberal Zionist publication, and The Guardian, of course, also a liberal publication, I suppose we could say, to some extent, also Zionist as well. They published a joint report about a platform that was called Hapsora. People might have heard about some other platforms that the IDF has deployed, like, for example, Where's Daddy and so forth. And in that report, that plus 972 Guardian report, it was stated that the Israelis or the IDF were using this platform to identify their targets and to dispatch killing devices, whether it's a jet or a drone or what have you, um, to their targets. And as I read this piece about a year ago, it occurred to me that the surely like cloud services were involved, and indeed in the plus 972 article, it was mentioned that the cloud technologies were likely used. And the reason why those technologies were used is that the amount of data that the IDF would be siphoning in, for example, your movements via cell phone, your location, where you lived before Gaza City was destroyed, um, various data points, that in order for that data to be stored and then analyzed, you would need a very large scale computational infrastructure. And this is really where cloud computing comes in, because um, the IDF would have had to, without cloud, so-called cloud, the IDF would have had to have created sprawling data centers that would be ever growing, actually, to store all this data. If you think about tracking one person's movements during the day, their social activity and so forth, well, you're going to be storing lots and lots and lots of data, gigabytes, maybe terabytes of data over time. Then multiply that by hundreds of thousands or millions of people, well, then it's going to be petabytes of data. And this is where the cloud shines, I should say. And it's the same rationale that's used. Let me clear my throat for a second. The same rationale that's used by private entities or corporations as to why they should employ so-called cloud. Because when I started my career, we would build these big data centers, but of course, maintaining data centers was not the core competency or concern of, say, a pharmaceutical company. They did it of necessity, but they'd rather not spend those millions or tens or hundreds of millions that they spent. Why not offload that to a provider as a service? Well, militaries have the exact same way of thinking. And also, this is how Microsoft and others, but again, Microsoft, because they're the most practiced and the slickest at promoting themselves into organizations. Amazon and Google really just barely hold a candle to Microsoft when it comes to having connections with individuals who are decision makers within education, as we talked about in our previous conversation, military, government, nonprofits, and so on. They are fantastic at pulling up. And if you need a guy in a $10,000 suit, well, then that guy is going to show up. If you need a guy, who seems California cool, well, that guy's going to show up, or gal is going to show up, right? That person will show up. And so, um, in the report, it was stated that the IDF had contracted with Microsoft, and that this was based upon a conversation or some meetings between the CEO of Microsoft, Satya Nadella, and other senior executives of Microsoft, and of course, senior officials of the IDF. And so I wasn't in the room, of course, but it's easy to imagine what the sales pitch was. You have a need to gather data, and we have the ability to give you a platform. And I visualized what that might look like based upon my experience. And more recently, it's turned out that I was essentially correct, because Microsoft not only essentially admitted that they did this, but then they claimed that they were taking actions to unravel their relationship with the IDF, which we'll get into in a bit. But in today's conversation, what I also wanted to do was provide um, people with a more grounded understanding of why the cloud is attractive to these organizations, what it provides to these organizations, and what it kind of looks like. Because we use these terms, we talk about it a lot, but When you describe in the introduction, when you described me, I said that I'm indeed a materialist, and I think that focusing on data centers and focusing on what the so-called value add, as people in the business say, is to organizations will explain why it's so easy for Microsoft and other firms to get into these arrangements, which are mutually beneficial. Microsoft was embarrassed by this, but you can't predict the future, but I expect that embarrassment probably won't translate into any seriously concrete actions. But they do claim that they have unraveled this relationship, which we'll get into.
Yeah, we will, because I think that that's quite a dubious claim at this point. But so let's look at this. Why don't you walk us through this architecture? I'm going to try my
Hmm.
best. I'm going to kind of move us around and make it a little bit bigger as we kind of
Hmm.
move from. I'll start with the left side so that you can kind of do our best. And this is maybe a little bit easier to see in the piece. So if people
Yes.
also want to try to like pull that up on their screen or look at it afterwards, it is in the kinetic harm article,
Hmm.
which is connected in the show description there. But
Hmm.
let's so help us start just by
Hmm.
let's like walk through this, okay?
Yeah. So in this part of the diagram, the architecture, high level, as we say, what you're looking at is what I'm theorizing as a stage of ingestion. That is to say, the collection of data and the sources of data, and this is key, the tagging of data. People are often amazed by the fact that, say, YouTube or Netflix or whoever, whatever platform, can make recommendations based upon your interests. Well, the reason why these recommendations can be made via what people sort of generically call the algorithm, but there's not one, there's many working within that platform, is because everything is tagged, by which I mean to each action, to each entity, so to speak, there is a value affixed that allows the software to identify what it is, right? So, because software doesn't know, but if you have a tagged value, such as, residence, cell phone, geolocation, name, and so forth, then you have the baseline of data that you need to create a data set. And if you go to the right, a little further to the right, you will see that what I'm proposing here is that at the heart of this, of course, is the collection. And in our first conversation, I talked about the importance of databases to capitalism's command and control function, or rather, computation's command and control function under capitalism. This data, the tag data of various sources, is collated in databases. So then you have a data set, you have a collection of information that you then can use. And if you go a little further to the right, you then can use um, for the analytical phase of this, in which using various machine learning tools and so forth, and various platforms. And here, because at the time I wasn't 100% certain if Microsoft solely was involved. I visualized the icons of the three major hyperscalers, as they're called: Microsoft, Amazon, and Google, the types of machine learning platforms that they offered at the time. Turns out it was primarily Microsoft. This analytical function then enables the military to be able to dispatch, right? And dispatch to a target, because you have the geolocation data, which has been tagged. You have various data points which allow you to then identify your targets and send a machine, which of course is remotely operated. I don't want to give people the impression that they're dispatching, science fiction robots. Like the drones are remotely operated, um, or fighter jets or what have you, to the target. So this is what we could call a kill chain, right? What's interesting to me is that when I first presented this on Twitter, which was my first mistake, when this came out, someone emerged from their gopher hole, and no shade on gophers, they're adorable creatures, but someone emerged from their hole to say, no, 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 that's not how it works at all. You don't know what a kill chain is, and And then I said, okay, well, why don't you propose an alternative architecture? And of course, the person did not. I was able to kind of assemble this high level visual based upon the information that was presented in plus 972. And of course, my experience with how, data is gathered, analyzed, and so forth in large enterprises, large organizations. And this is, I think, how these things are used. And also, it's important to bear in mind that although the endpoint of this particular chain is death, to be frank, the same kind of chain is used for advertisement. The same kind of chain is used for recommendation. This flow of data storage analysis is typically used in our life every day for things that seem quite benign. But I want people to note that these things can be repurposed for lethal ends or for repressive ends. ICE, for example, is clearly using something similar to this. Palantir's proposed or maybe deployed platform, it would be very similar to this. Although, because we don't have any real tech journalism anymore, people are not going to just sit down and do their homework and say, well, how would this likely work? But this is the kind of chain of, as I say, ingestion of data, collection of data into databases, analysis of data, and then the taking of action based upon that data using various kind of analytical tools. This is the model that we are dealing with in multiple situations today.
Yeah, I mean, I really appreciate you laying that out. It's it made me think of the fact that Instagram has a great understanding of what types of ads that
Yeah,
I want to see. Like what
yeah,
what I actually will be like, "Ooh, there's a new box set
yeah.
for MF Doom's
Hmm.
reissue
Hmm.
of, or the,
Hmm.
oh, the Supreme Clientele cereal box. I'm oof, how am I going to pass
Right.
that up?
Exactly.
Um
Exactly.
and like that's obviously, I think people often go to the like, "Oh, is it listening to me?" And sometimes I think that is happening.
There is, yes, that technology does exist, but because of course we have software that can recognize, at least when it comes to English, that can recognize certain words, and then uh, but the same thing is this. But note that it's the same kind of chain: ingestion of data, storage of data, analysis of data, action based upon that data, right? Um, and so in the case of Insta and in the case of, all other platforms in which they're trying to get you to do something else, to take action, as I said, it's tagging. All of these things are tagged. Tagging is key to the ability to identify you, what you like, who you are, where you live, what you do, and to track you throughout space and time, right? And to create a data map of who you are, which is not 100% accurate, of course, but is accurate enough for them to be able to, advertise and to interdict, and also to kill. And so again, this is why I want to stress that it's important for people to understand this, because this template applies to almost everything that we're dealing with. And cloud, so-called cloud, hyperscale computation is necessary for this because, you know, uh, individual companies are very unlikely to want to build the physical infrastructure because data seems weightless, but it has a weight, and the weight is depicted behind me in my background, which are servers, which are built objects, which consume energy and require cooling and all the rest of it. Every bit of data carries weight because, of course, it's in these types of machines, which are physical objects, right? Taking up real estate, and so it makes tactical sense or strategic sense, maybe even financial sense, for an organization like the IDF to say, yeah, we're going to offload, this function to Microsoft, and Microsoft is more than happy to accommodate them. And I imagine that when they started this relationship, and I'm sure there was previous relationship, but even before the genocide, but um, you know, people were able to excuse themselves by saying that Israel is defending democracy or and that sort of thing. And so I'm sure that those are the kinds of conversations that were happening. How proud we are, at Microsoft to be, providing technical services, high-level technical services to this heroic nation and so forth. And just as Microsoft, if you do a Google search for Microsoft Department of Defense, or maybe they charge it Department of War now, you'll see a splashy page which shows F-35s and guys with in full kit, and then a Microsoft logo and so forth, because they offer the exact same types of services to the Pentagon.
Yeah, of course they do. And this is
Shocking if they didn't.
yeah. I mean, we go back and we look at all of the companies that were critical to Nazi Germany, or all of the companies that provided technology to apartheid South Africa. And unfortunately, I mean, we go back to Nazi Germany, and a lot of them were German companies, of course, in that time frame. But there were also U.S. companies and other companies that did invest and supported and all of
Such as
that kind of
IBM,
stuff.
yeah.
Right,
Such as
IBM.
yeah.
Yeah,
And
and
actually, it's. I'm glad you mentioned that, because what was IBM's role with what was called, I believe, the Hollerith machine at the time in the 1930s, up until the time that war was declared, and maybe even afterwards, who knows? But sorting, collating, storing. They didn't have electronic computers; they had mechanical computers, but it still gave you the ability to perform this sorting, collating, and then taking action based upon the data and tagging. They had their own version of tagging the data, right, within the punch cards, for sorting by category. So this is the logic, I think, of capitalism, which of course is placing us into categories for selling. But again, as things become a bit dodgier, or significantly dodgier, actually, and the neoliberal order unravels, I think we will see increasing use. We are seeing, well, I don't think, we are seeing the increasing use of these methodologies for repression and attack.
yeah, I'm gonna pull something up really quick too,
Hmm.
just to. I was looking at this as you were just talking, but
Hmm.
the folks probably saw Francesca Albanese's report, at least at a glance,
Hmm.
which was in June of this year. The economy of occupation, from economy of occupation to economy of genocide. And
Hmm.
she doesn't even in this one, I don't think, deal with well, let's see. So here's a couple of things. She brings up a few things. So she does talk about this. So she says Microsoft, Alphabet, and Amazon grant Israel virtually government-wide access to their cloud and
Hmm.
artificial intelligence technologies, enhancing data processing, decision-making, and surveillance and analysis capacities. In October 2023, when the Israeli internal military cloud overloaded Microsoft with its Azure program, and the Project Nimbus consortium stepped in with critical cloud and artificial intelligence infrastructure. Their Israeli located servers ensure data sovereignty and a shield from accountability under favorable contracts, offering minimal restrictions and oversight. In July 2024, an Israeli colonel described cloud tech as a weapon in every sense of the word,
Hmm.
citing these companies. So that's one section where she brings it up. And there is one more. Hang
Hmm.
on. That's interesting. That's how much BlackRock has invested in. And then she brings up, actually, she's got a lot in here on Microsoft.
Always
I need to go.
BlackRock.
Yeah, I know. But where was it? This is the piece. Yeah. So Microsoft has been active in Israel since 1991, developing its largest center outside the United States. Its technologies are embedded in the prison service, police, universities, and schools,
Hmm.
including in colonies. Colonies being the so-called occupied territories, I think. Microsoft has been integrating its system and civilian tech across Israeli military since 2003, while acquiring Israeli cyber security and surveillance startups. So,
Hmm.
anyways, just a good also report that gives us hard facts also on
Yeah,
how
and note
embedded.
the year 1991.
Mhm.
So those of us who were around at the time, think back to how Israel was presented at that time. We were starting to get we're beginning to see like the startup nation um, talk propaganda. That this not only is it scrappy, not only is it like a little Sparta, in West Asia or the Middle East, as people say, but it was a nation of people who were very tech savvy and developing new things. And now that you read that, I do recall at the time reading about Microsoft's investments, and then seeing, and I think Israel as its Middle Eastern hub, right? That they would spring out from there. Um, so yeah, it's a long standing relationship, which, of course, is always because of uh, the nature of this other colonial project cannot help but leak into all sorts of repressive activities.
Well, and I think it's important to say the first Intifada started in 87 and goes
Mm,
until like
mm,
93 too. So it's
mm,
also like right in the middle
mm.
of them having to figure out how do we recalibrate
Right,
our
right.
control and surveillance mechanisms
That's right.
amid upheaval, and
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and which is interesting because it reminds me of, and we talked about this briefly before, but the sensor array, the jungle sensor array that Robert McNamara dreamed of, and actually the U.S. deployed in Vietnam in the late 1960s, because by the late 1960s you had motion sensing technologies, and you had computational systems that were then brought into Vietnam, to gather all this data, because what they were trying to do, of course, was control movement. I think this was part of the strategic Hamlet program that the U.S. Put into place, and maybe even Operation Phoenix, which was to destroy the Viet Cong. Um, these themes keep repeating, and one of the things that I think we keep coming back to in our conversations is that digital computation is always at the heart of all of these activities, because without it, you'd have to hire 100,000 people writing things down, which is how things were done in the past, of course. But you couldn't, like Sears and Roebuck had a vast human-based computational system. Um, People who know Franz Kafka knows that his day job, was analyzing data for an insurance company in Prague. Right, there was lots of jobs like that. I think Einstein had a job similar to that, um, before he found his path. So before digital computation, this was very human intensive, which means that it could only scale but so much. I think, as I recall, there was a story about the Stasi in East Germany having employing many, many, many thousands of people, um, to listen and so forth, and to record, and all of that. And you can create, of course, an infrastructure like that, which states did. Um, but there's only but so much, but so far it could scale. And there's always a human element. People can be bribed. People may not agree with what you're doing. People may get tired and say, "Well, Jim went to the donut shop." Well, I don't know. Did he? I really don't know. But with tagging, of course, and digital computation and devices such as this one, right? Um, you know, tracking us all the time, then we are providing the data. We are providing the data to states and to militaries. And so the combination of the fact that we are contributing, we are participating, and the fact that with digital computation at scale, so-called cloud, they have the ability to, as I said, ingest, collate into databases, analyze, and then take action. I think that's, if people take nothing else away from this conversation, I want the reality of that to kind of sink into your head as you move through the world, that this is what's happening. And this is why it's also important for people to take counter moves. If you are involved in things that put you on the state's radar, you have to take counter moves with, well, everybody's on their state's radar, but particularly on the state's radar. You need to take counter moves based upon an understanding of how how that flow works.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it, and I would love to dig in more deeply on that conversation with you too about thinking about counter moves and what effective ones are, and maybe we could say a little bit about that. But let's do you want to walk through some of this data? You sent me some links to Microsoft's promotion of its data centers and things like that. Do you want to walk through
Yeah,
some of
you know
that?
what? Let me the one that I'd like to actually have people look at, because it's very interactive and it's very Microsofty, by which I mean that, they it's very flashy, like
Yep.
so the in the document, let me get the link and I'll drop it in
I
the
have
thing.
I have
You have
them
it?
set, I
Yes.
think. So there's
Yeah,
the data
the
centers
virtual
one, and then
tour.
there's the virtual
Yeah,
tour.
the
All right.
virtual tour. Yeah, I
All
think
right.
that's a good
Let me
a
pull it
good
up and make sure it's the
yeah.
right one. Is it is it this one?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, and you can browse through this, go through this menu, right? Because what Microsoft is doing here is they're giving you an idea of what one of their Azure data centers looks like. How things are organized, and it's cute, yes. Like, oh, here you are in the lobby. It's oh, what a lovely lobby. And there are certain things that are interactive, and they're trying to make it very homey. You can browse around. But when we've talked about this in the past, and I've mentioned data centers, one of the things that I've emphasized is that they're like giant warehouses, these data centers, into which computers and corresponding equipment are collected to create platforms. So when people say Azure, and here they're saying that, oh, you know what, your data is secure. Don't worry, it's a secure zone. Because of course, you wouldn't want anybody to be able to just stroll in, this biometric entry. I've actually been in data centers in which I had to scan, like in a movie, I had to scan my eyeballs and the whole thing. Um, yeah, monitored infrastructure, hardware recycling. Now they claim that they recycle the hardware, and this is somewhat true, but not as true as they would like you to believe. Because if it was true, if it was as possible as they say, then they wouldn't have to keep mining the earth to create new servers. Cyber defense talks about what they're doing to protect your data. If you're an organization that uses the Azure cloud, that there are people. Here we see this fellow, I'll just call him Harry, looking at this blurry screen. There he is, very eerily making sure that your data is secure. Um, yeah, cloud security. I don't know what this guy's doing. I mean, is he a Super Saiyan about to do a blast? I don't know, but but anyway, but you see the idea here, and what Microsoft is doing is giving their existing customers and their potential customers a a taste of what these data centers are. And even though this is all marketing fluff, it does give you some idea of what's going on. Now, I suggest we go to the other link that's in that document, because it also gives you an idea of the global reach of these data centers. Yeah. So this is telling you click on the one that says Azure Global Infrastructure, which I think is right to the right of welcome. Yeah. So the Azure platform and all cloud platforms, certainly the ones that are owned by Amazon and Google, have data centers like the one you saw in the previous marketing material. Data centers scattered across the globe, right? So almost like a kind of a plague. But this is why data centers are such an impactful. How would I put this? Yeah, East US. I know this region well. This is why data centers are such an impactful um, technology or technology platform. because not only because they're so large, not only because they consume so much energy, but because they're building so many of them, and they're building many of them, in order to feed this AI push. You might notice if you when you look at the ocean, that these lines going across, right? Um, I believe now this may be showing trenches, but I think some of these may be, yeah, I think they're showing actually undersea cables that connect the globe. Like I'm in Europe and you're in North America. We're talking via an undersea cable. So what you're seeing here, and this is interesting because, and Microsoft's quite good at this because even though this is all for marketing, it is giving you like really important information about about the physical infrastructure, the infrastructure that powers their platform that's being used by, of course, various entities, government and private. Yeah, and it's a tremendous amount of information. Actually, I don't think Amazon gives you this much information. I don't think Google does either. But yeah, they're. I wouldn't call it being open, but I would, and they're kind of bragging, obviously, a bit. Um, but as I say, the takeaway from this, I want for the audience is to have some vision of just how expansive what people call cloud is. That not only is it physical, as we've mentioned before, but it stretches the globe, and they want to build more of these data centers. So more of these little greenish lights, across the planet. Yeah, so you can begin to browse the regions, right? And each of these, a data center.
Wow. Uh, it's a lot to take in that way,
Yeah, it's a
Um,
massive. It is a massive, and I would say unprecedented. Um, in a different world, we might call this like a technical achievement, right? In a different world, because it is actually quite impressive, even if in a sinister way, and also bear in mind that this is just Microsoft. A similar build out across the globe, as I said, can be found for Amazon, can be found for Google, no doubt, Oracle, others. But Microsoft, Amazon, and Google are the ones who have built the most extensive and impactful um, sprawling data center infrastructure across the planet. Oh,
I'm muted. Yeah. Um, no, I thank you for showing that. Do you want to dig into the boy cat piece a little bit? Because I know this was the
yeah,
one that kind of spawned
yeah,
you to like
the
say, hey,
the
let's
boycott
chat about
piece.
this.
So yeah, boycott is a group, and in fact, I want to bring up. I want to read actually from their piece. There's a article from boycott and called "Everything You Need to Know About How Microsoft Aided Israel's War on Gaza." And what I've done is I've taken some uh, excerpts that I consider to be really critical to understanding what this is all about. And I'm going to read a few of them now. So, from the Boycott article, one of the most chilling discoveries from the leaked documents, and they're referring to the documents that Plus 972 and The Guardian and other journalists uncovered, leaked from Microsoft. One of the most chilling discoveries from the leaked documents was the revelation that Israel's military was storing millions of intercepted Palestinian phone calls using Microsoft's cloud infrastructure. According to reporting, these calls were used to help generate bombing targets in Gaza. So take your mind back, pausing from the article, reading the article, take your mind back to the architecture that we talked about earlier. The gathering of millions of intercepted Palestinian phone calls using the cloud infrastructure. And then calls were used to help generate bombing targets. All right, reading on. In one instance, the logo, or rather I'm taking my glasses off so I can see more clearly. In one instance, the logo for Microsoft Azure appeared alongside Amazon Web Services and Google Cloud in a military slide deck presented by a senior Israeli officer. According to leaked internal remarks, Colonel Racheli Dembinsky from the IDF's computing unit described cloud partners like Microsoft as providing, quote, very significant operational effectiveness. The surveillance systems developed with Microsoft support allowed Israeli forces to track civilian movements, analyze behavior, make decisions about who to strike. All of this data, stored and processed using Microsoft's tools, became fuel for the war, which is another way of saying that without this platform, right? Without this platform, although of course Israel could have conducted, would have conducted um, its campaign, yeah, the platform made it much more effective, much more lethal.
Yeah. And so one of the things it talks about too is this idea recently that OpenAI removed a so-called ban that it had on
Yes.
the use of its tools for military purposes,
Hmm.
and talks about how these restrictions in January 2024 were quietly removed. And we have seen somebody else brought up, in the chat. Shout out to Ode to John Trudell. That there have been reactions too
Oh
by
yes,
Microsoft employees.
absolutely, absolutely.
Um, yeah.
Yeah, and yeah, salute to them, right, for putting themselves on the line and actually in the belly of the beast at Redmond, at Microsoft headquarters, at Microsoft facilities, in Microsoft shareholder meetings, in Microsoft technical events. Um, I think that, and so they are absolutely correct and righteous for doing so. Now, we cannot expect, of course, the corporation to respond in an honest way, but that doesn't mean that, of course, you don't resist. It just means that you also know that your adversary isn't going to stop, really. However, their actions make people aware. They make people absolutely aware of what's going on.
Yeah, absolutely. So we'll come back to what we're talking about, but this is something that you and I were chatting about actually before this, because this is a sentiment that I come across frequently, and I know you come across it as well. And the idea that the technology isn't the issue; it's the people controlling and directing it. What I would say, just for myself, is um, the word "the" is doing a lot of work there, right? Because I don't think it's technology in and of itself that is the issue. But I do think that the types of technology that we have and the uses that they are put to are a product of capitalist imperialism. And even when you think about, I'm reading The Accumulation of Waste right now with our study group with Ali Kadri, and he talks about the bomb as like the perfect capitalist commodity in a certain way, right? And you know there's uh there's multiple ways to think about this, which is one, that in the near or immediate term, like the the means to abolish the use of all these technologies are not going to be with us. And so to some extent, whether it's a state like Cuba, or whether it's China, or whoever else, right? They're going to need to have tools of technology in order to defend their sovereignty and their projects against states that might seek to overthrow it, right, in an imperialist world system. Um, but in the long term, I think there's a huge issue with a lot of these technologies that we're talking about specifically, and the uses that they are designed for in themselves. And so I'm just curious how you kind of think about this as a materialist and a Marxist, this idea.
My response to that idea is that I insist upon precision, by which I mean um, technology is a generic term. Now, if by computer technology we mean what has been created under capitalism, well, I would argue, I propose that the problem is not merely who controls it, but the fact that the way that it has been designed and deployed is an outgrowth. of the kind of society from which it came. That is to say, computation is something that, in a general sense, we certainly could have developed. In our first conversation, I mentioned the work of the early British cyberneticians, such as Stafford Beer, who I admire. Um, their vision, that group of individuals' vision of computation, was radically different from what we have, because their vision of computation was based upon the original Greek word Kubernetes, which for navigating complexity, right? Not command and control. So you can imagine a different society in which you have something like a computational, substrate, or a computational methods, a way of helping a complex society navigate nature, navigate its own needs, right? A way of collating data, analyzing data, even ingesting the data, of course, that was not based upon command and control, but digital computation at its heart serves command and control. Uh, Therefore, it serves repression. It cannot but do that because that's what it was built for. This doesn't mean you can't use computers for other things, but we are not exploring other ways of organizing, other types of information technologies, other ways of organizing information technologies. We're not even doing research into these other things. Even analog computation and mechanical computation was abandoned because of digital computation. Why? Now, some people would tell you, well, it's because digital computation is better. But I would challenge that. I would say, better for whom, right? Better for what? And people will say, well, speed, efficiency, and so forth, which means what? For who? Well, for capitalism, right? And so I'm not anti-technology, right? That's absurd. A fork is technology, a shoe is technology, a road is technology. It'd be silly to say, oh, I'm anti-technology. No, I am saying that uh, this infrastructure um, cannot serve our purposes. It cannot. We have to dream bigger. We have to dream different, right? We have to look at what it is and look at the actual category. Well, we need information. We need a method of processing and collecting and analyzing. But does it have to be this? Does it have to be what we have now? And my firm answer is no. And for me, that is a non-negotiable, because I think I've seen it over and over and over again. People try to do different things with this particular type of technology, and it always snaps back to what it's actually designed for. Stafford Beer once said, "The purpose of a system is what it does." The cyberneticist Stafford Beer. People may have heard that phrase. Well, that's where it comes from, and he said this in response to analyzing our world. So he's saying, listen, if what you're getting is what you're seeing, repression, death, destruction, poverty, that's what this system is built for. That is its purpose, right? Is to produce those things. And computation, as currently deployed and is currently built, I would say, is at the heart of that. Also, colonialism is, as we said in our first conversation, is intimately tied with the kind of computation we have today. I got into a discussion with someone about nuclear energy, kind of a left-wing type person, or lefty, and he said, "Well, we'll just take over, the production of uranium." I said, "Yeah, but right now, uranium is extracted. It's based upon colonialism. This is why France, has such a large presence in Africa. One of the reasons why they had such a large presence in Africa, and why they were so upset and freaked out, in addition to, racist shock at being upended by your supposed inferiors." Because France's entire successful nuclear energy program, which people applaud around the globe, is based upon colonialism, access to resources. So, what would a decolonized computational supply chain look like? These are the kinds of things we have to talk about, because the development of the type of integrated circuit chips and the game processing units and all these things that we depend upon right now is completely built upon colonialism. So yeah, it's not just the people. It would be like if you made me the CEO of Exxon, I would just be a guy who was promoting oil, as socialist or what have you as I am today. If you said, Dwayne, you're now the CEO of Exxon, your job is to maximize shareholder value of Exxon. The fact that I'm a nice guy has nothing to do with it, right? Because I'm would be part of a system whose job it is to extract resources, and sell them.
Yeah, absolutely. As you were talking, I just pulled up just for folks, just
Hmm.
a few days ago, the World Bank
Look
court,
at that.
which the fact that the World Bank has a court is also like, what
Yeah,
the
yeah. How about that?
talk about a colonial technology,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
Um,
exactly.
that they have blocked Niger's, ability to sell uranium from their
Hmm.
own uranium mine,
Yes, yes.
which is just, again, I mean, just wild, right?
It's insane, but
You
it's so
know,
obvious. It's so obvious
yeah,
that Niger says this uranium belongs to us, and anyone who wants to have a nuclear power industry, um, why don't you buy your uranium from us? And the World Bank, I'm glad you pointed that out, because it's so naked, right? That no, no, no. How dare you kick France out? How dare you do that? Now, your primary resource, a gift from the earth, now you can't sell it on the global market, right? So they're trying to pressure them, obviously, into returning to being managed, controlled by France.
yeah,
And so this is what I mean, that the system that produces computation is part of this machinery, this political economy, and it cannot be repurposed. And you know if there was a revolution today, and people said, oh, I'm going to take over these Microsoft data centers or what have you, I think that you would find that in order to maintain them, you would have to do the same things that Microsoft does.
well, at minimum, it would require the same impact to the
Same
environment that,
impacts to the environment, precisely.
you know,
Yeah, and so
and so
you could walk into that data center lobby that we saw, virtual version of, carrying a copy of What Is to Be Done by Lenin. It doesn't matter.
uh all right. So back to, was there anything else on the boycott piece that you wanted to
No, I think
kind
the
of
boycott
highlight?
piece, yeah, did a really good job of like laying out what the impacts are and what the relationship is. And then there, and in the our shared document, there was an apparent reversal by
Yeah.
Microsoft, and in which was reported by the Guardian. And I'm going to read parts of this as well, because it's actually quite interesting the way that Microsoft, is presenting this. So from an article from The Guardian from only September 25th. Microsoft blocks Israel's use of its technology in mass surveillance of Palestinians. So here are a few excerpts. Microsoft told Israeli officials late last week that Unit 8200, the military's elite spy agency, had violated the company's terms of service by storing the vast trove of surveillance data in its Azure cloud platform. Sources familiar with the situation said, I love that classic journalist phrase, sources familiar. Anyway, let's pause here for a moment. Violated the company's terms of service by storing the vast trove of surveillance data in its Azure cloud platform. Now, one of the things that the Boycott article mentions is that, of course, this relationship was based upon a contractual agreement at the highest levels of both the Israeli military and Microsoft as a corporation, right? So, what Microsoft is saying here is, oh my God, what? This was used you violate our terms of service. All right, I'm going to read on. In a joint investigation with the Israeli Palestinian publication Plus 972 magazine and the Hebrew language outlet Local Call, The Guardian revealed how Microsoft and Unit 8200 had worked together on a plan to move large volumes of sensitive intelligence material into Azure. So, of course, that's the report from last year that we talked about. In response to the investigation, Microsoft ordered an urgent external inquiry to review its relationship with Unit 8200. Its initial findings have now led the company to cancel the unit's access to some of its cloud storage and AI services. Here's a key bit. Equipped with Azure's near limitless storage capacity and computing power. Now that's marketing speak right there. Nothing is limitless. Unit 8200 had built an indiscriminate new system allowing its intelligence officers to collect, play back, and analyze the content of cellular calls of an entire population. So there's also a bit of misdirection here as well, indiscriminate. And of course, the entire purpose of having an analytical platform is that it's extremely discriminate, right? I'll read on and then we'll get back to it. According to several sources, the enormous repository of intercepted calls, which amounted to as much as 8,000 terabytes of data, so petabytes, was held in a Microsoft data center in the Netherlands. Within days of The Guardian publishing the investigation, Unit 8200 appears to have swiftly moved their surveillance data out of the country. Again, again, when I read something like this, as a person who works with this technology, I know that I'm being lied to. You do not move petabytes of data within days out of anything, right? So that data is no doubt still in the location, but because of the embarrassment, because of the bad press, they're saying that they've taken immediate action, as if they've moved an old style cassette tape or CD from one closet to another. According to sources familiar with the huge data center outside of the EU country, it occurred in early August. Intelligence sources said Unit 8200 planned to transfer the data to the Amazon Web Services cloud platform. Neither the Israeli Defense Forces, IDF, nor Amazon responded to requests for comment. I'll read this final piece because it's really important. The decision has not affected Microsoft's wider commercial relationship with the IDF, which is a long-standing client and will retain access to other services. The termination will raise questions within Israel about the policy of holding sensitive military data in a third-party cloud hosted overseas. So, even though the article is liberal speak, there are clues if you know where to look, right? The first clue I mentioned being that, oh, we've moved like this tremendous amount of data, like an insane amount of data. We just moved it like that, from one location to the next. Another bit of information that they plan to move it to Amazon Web Services, Microsoft's competitor, right? So Microsoft losing business. And then the third clue that saying that, well, even so, Microsoft is going to retain its relationship. And there's nothing to stop the IDF from simply building another solution, as we call them, inside of Azure. So if you're not canceling their access to the platform, then they can still do what they want. So this begs the question, well, then what has actually happened in response to this revelation? It seems to me that what has happened is a PR release and not much else. And the idea that there was some urgent meeting in Microsoft about this, well, I'm sure there was, but I'm sure the urgency of the meeting was, how are we going to manage this bad press? And their approach has been to, well, we're moving the data, and they'll take some of their stuff to AWS, Amazon Web Services, but we'll still have the relationship. So what this means is now that the IDF is splitting their functions between two American hyperscalers. If AWS is probably already there, but probably already operating there, I'm sure. But yeah, they're just basically splitting the load, so to speak, or splitting the workload, I should say, between these platforms. So I think that from the evidence provided by Guardian, even liberal coach though it is, I think we can conclude that not much is actually happening.
Yeah, I agree. And it also seems like some of what has gone on related to this is that it embarrassed the Netherlands along the way, right? And so the Netherlands probably had to have a conversation with
Yes.
Microsoft about, hey, if you're going to store this in a data center in our country,
Yes.
then we're going to have to maybe go take our services to Amazon or
Yeah,
something
because
like that.
here,
Yeah.
yeah, here there are people who react negatively to that. Who are concerned. There certainly are groups who are pro-Palestinian and or just basically against genocide as a human matter, who, upon learning this, are horrified and petition the government and protest and so on. So, absolutely, yes. So embarrassment of multiple parties, but yeah, you don't move petabytes of data, within a few days. You need a while to do something like that. I've had to move lots of data from place to place, and across a cable across the ocean. Yeah, no.
Yeah, certainly not. I mean, I'm laughing at myself a little bit because I'm thinking about how long it takes me to move a downloaded episode of the video from this to a
Right.
backup hard drive or whatever. But I imagine you all have slightly more sophisticated means of doing that than I do, but
It
probably
still
not.
takes time. Still takes time,
Yeah,
though.
yeah. Um, All right, so where do we go next? Was there other elements of this that we wanted to dig into? I
I
got
think
your
those. I
excerpt
think those
here.
are the main. I think those are the
Those are
main
the main ones.
elements, actually. Going back to the beginning, that I want people to take away, the chain, um, which, as I said, impacts all of our lives. That chain of data, of tagging of data, ingestion of data, collation of data in databases, the analysis of that data, and then the taking of action, based upon what the analytics, are telling, the party who who controls the platform and what they want to do.
Yeah, I mean, maybe we could talk about that a little bit
Hmm.
because I think that this is something that is challenging for all of us at this point with
Yes.
all of the things um, that we have welcomed into our lives,
Yes.
because for as much as some of us may have been resistant to certain aspects of it, there are, pieces of them that we just can't really imagine life without anymore at
That's
a
right.
certain point.
That's right.
Um, and there's all of I mean, with every one of these apps and, you know, services, so called, that are on your phone, there's always all of these levels of access
Hmm.
that it's trying to get. I mean,
Hmm.
how real is that? Like, if I say to something, you can never access this data, and then it says, well, then you can't use this part of this service or whatever, or if I use the only this time function,
Hmm.
or you know what I mean? I mean, like,
I
I,
do.
I, I mean, and maybe that's not even where to start the conversation, but I'm curious for you as someone who is more intimately aware of what this device is doing all the
Hmm.
time, and we
Hmm.
can, I mean, it's very real. I mean, what we're talking about, like, to reground it in Gaza,
Hmm.
we're talking about the fact that people in Gaza have cell phones,
That's
right?
right.
That they use them because they need, for a variety of
That's right.
reasons, some of which is even to try to get fundraising to people
That's right.
that are in the diaspora or in the West. Like the fundraiser we did this week for Samir Project,
That's
right?
right.
Or for individual folks. And they're communicating, obviously, with their families and friends inside of Gaza when they get separated, or just on a day-to-day basis, just like all of us. But they're also on WhatsApp, and they're also
Hmm.
on social media and all of these things. And what you're saying is that all of those data points have been
Hmm.
harvested
Yes.
by Israel
Yeah.
through services that have been provided, whether it's through
Hmm.
Microsoft or
Hmm.
Amazon or Google, and that they're analyzed through the IOF's own technology unit, and that
Hmm.
this is producing targeting information that they're
Hmm.
using to say, okay, this is an acceptable cost for us. Maybe, I mean, that's also an interesting part of the computation that maybe we
Hmm.
should say a little bit about, is that there's a calculation that
Hmm.
goes on in warfare with regards to, like, what is acceptable
Hmm.
collateral damage
Hmm.
for a military strike, which
Yes.
on its own, again, is a horrendous considerate. I mean,
Yes.
I should say, like, I have a base rejection of the type of computation that is
Hmm.
done here, because it says, well, if we value a target in such and such a way, then it's
Hmm.
okay if dozens of people are killed.
Yes.
You know, um, dozens of people who have nothing to do with it whatsoever, right? And
That's right.
that's one of the things that the piece talks about, is knowing that, you know, if they claim that they're going after a legitimate target at all, which is based off of some sort of suspicion at some
Hmm.
point, right?
Hmm.
Um, that there's a calculation of, well, there's a baby in that apartment, there's a
Hmm.
mother, there's a this, and they know all of this through
Hmm.
the cell phone data of all of these people.
That's right.
And so
And also the fact that in the case of the Palestinians, well, in our case too, but in the Palestinians in a somewhat even more restricted way, of course, people had to register, go through checkpoints, and so at these points, of course, their movements are tracked, their residences, who's in the residence, like all that data is also collated. So you would have that, so if you wanted to kill an entire family, you know that at 2 in the morning it's likely that everybody's home sleeping, right? You have this data, um, because everyone has been again tagged, right? Tagging has been applied to every living person, within within a space, and then their movement, within the space. But I wanted to talk a bit about the mythology of precision, versus the reality of mass death. In the Second World War, which was the time in which aerial bombardment really came into its own, on a mass scale, there was a
heavily promoted by Walt Disney, by the way,
oh
who
my God,
made
yes, I saw that, and Toomey recommended that, and I watched that. Victory Through Air Power from like 1943, I believe it was, and it's a chilling movie. It's like we will destroy. And that's an important movie. I think you should link to it because it shows an ideology that continues to this day. But in the Second World War, there was a debate, a kinetic debate, if you will, between the U.S. Army Air Corps and the RAF, the Royal Air Force of Britain, over how best to wage war against Germany. The Americans believed in precision bombing. They had built a thing called the Northern Bomb Sight, and they believed that they could calculate and use mathematics and calculating wind speed. And the B-17 is flying, and well, it's going at this rate of speed, and it's over the target at this time, and then we can drop the bomb. We know the bomb moves, and then we can only hit the ball bearing plant. Anyone who knows World War II stuff knows that they were always trying to blow up ball bearing plants because that's what tanks used. All sorts of equipment used it. Um, and therefore, you could destroy the enemy's capacity for war, right, without having too many civilian casualties. That was the idea. The British, on the other hand, being well practiced imperialists, said, no, what we're going to do is we're going to just bomb the city. And yes, we'll bomb the waterfront, we'll bomb the port, we'll bomb the military facilities, but we will also terror bomb the people. Because I forget his name now, who was the leader of the commander of the RAF, Harris. They called him Bomber Harris, as a matter of fact. And you can find speeches of his on YouTube, from the time in which he said that the Germans deserve to be terrorized because of what they're doing. So this is full scale war, he was saying. Therefore, if Hamburg is going to be destroyed, and I don't care if it's ball bearing plants, I don't care if it's a grandma, Hamburg will be destroyed. That was his philosophy. Now, the Americans continued for a time with this idea of precision, even though there was carpet bombing in Vietnam and Laos and so forth. Um, but there was the mythology, which we also saw in the Gulf War, of precision. Remember the idea of smart bombs and so forth. I think that this was a goal, not for humanitarian reasons, of course, but because of the American technocratic obsession with refining technology, an obsession that seems to have fallen away in the era of nitwittery, of evil stupidity. But in any event, eventually, the Americans in World War II admitted that, well, this isn't really working. Our bomb sites aren't good enough, and we don't have the technology yet. By the time of the 1980s, 1990s, 2000s, of course, you had computation, you had GPS, you had other things. But even so, to your point, a JDAM ordinance guided by GPS or laser guided would still kill many people who had nothing to do with whatever it is you were trying to accomplish, right? Because they really don't care, even though they were showing off their precision. I think that what we have now is a return, in a way, aided by computation, and this is the strange thing about it, a return to the Balmer Harris philosophy of kill them all. But it's a combination of the American ideology of precision with the ideology of complete death. Because now, via computation, you have the means of identifying everyone, so that even though you would have bombed anyway, now you have a kill list. Now you say this family has been eliminated. This entire neighborhood has been eliminated. Everyone who knows these people, they've all been eliminated. This is the deadly, sinister, evil game that's being played now, in which you're combining these two ideologies into an overall campaign of death. And uh, I think that it's the collapse of certain it's the collapse of certain illusions on the part of the imperialists, um, but retaining some of that old belief in precision, and it also gives them, as I said, the ability to hope to eliminate all of their enemies at once. Now, it's a vain hope, because you destroy some and then more people arise, and also it's not as clever as they think. I mean, the pager attack that the Israelis staged or conducted, the Western media was just falling all over themselves to talk about how amazingly clever it was. But that occurred because they owned the supply chain. They had access to the supply chain. They put explosives. They could trigger it, and it was indeed indiscriminate, right? I mean, we've all seen the videos of, like, children, in a candy shop, people shopping for their evening dinner, this sorts of thing, because and that's a good example of what I'm talking about, because even though they claim precision, they killed many people and harmed many people who had nothing to do with what they claim, because they now believe, as Harris did in World War II of the Germans, they believe that everyone is guilty, right? Which is why I mention him, because that philosophy, I think, now has come full circle.
Yeah. No, I think you're right. I mean, I think there's multiple things I think about philosophically or whatever related to all of this. But I mean, there was a point at which, when this reporting first came out, like the original plus 972 piece, I remember some people saying, well, you know, just to give people context, like all Israeli publications are under some form of military
Hmm. Hmm.
censorship, right? So the
Hmm.
military still has the ability to say, what can and can't be released. And
Hmm.
actually, within the United States, this is somewhat true as well. I mean, there are things that the New York Times and the Washington Post, for instance,
Mm.
won't print because,
Hmm.
the Pentagon or the CIA or
Yes.
whatever tells them that you're not going to do that.
Yes.
Unlike unlike we see in the movies often.
Yeah.
Um,
Yes.
but but the thing that was, brought up was this idea that, well, this could just be for the purposes of plausible deniability, right? If
Hmm.
you're adding in this hefty layer of AI,
Hmm.
which in reality just means digital computation at a certain
Hmm.
scale, then at least you're saying, well, the computer is making the decision, right?
Mm.
Or they like to say AI because we get a vision of
Hmm.
some freaking robot from a Will Smith movie or whatever
Yeah,
figuring
right.
out like what's
Yeah,
going on here.
exactly,
Um,
exactly.
but the but the point being that a human, right, if the human is not making the targeting decision, ultimately
Hmm.
if a computer is generating the target and saying this is a
Hmm.
good target, then in a case of a war crime or something like that, then it becomes a question of, well, who's actually at fault here?
Yes,
And if it becomes a corporate thing, well, then how
yes,
much do they have, how much fault do they have if they didn't know it
yes.
was being used in just this way, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? I don't There may have been a point at which, and maybe, and I hope that it will arise again, a point at which Israel is deeply concerned about being prosecuted for genocide and war crimes. Maybe they're more afraid than I think they are, and I hope that's the case. I hope that they, have
Hmm.
some fear of that. But I I feel more in terms in line with what you have said, which is that this is a logic of mass death. That this is
Yes.
that it's a way it's a way of just systematizing death, and
Yeah.
maybe it provides some level of buffer for the people who are pushing the button to say, okay, well, that maybe for that individual, it makes them
Mm.
feel a little bit better that the computer is telling them the right things to hit,
Hmm.
and they feel like, okay, I can I can believe what this machine is telling me because it's
Yeah.
doing these intense calculations, and so it
Yeah.
must be right. But I don't even know that that would matter. I mean, it's
Yeah, I don't think it. Yeah, I think that. I mean, we can't know for certain, but I suspect, just based upon experience with how people think about these things, is that the original idea was obscuring culpability, just in just the way you say. But because the actual goal is genocidal, it doesn't. It ultimately doesn't matter, right? Because whatever the computer is spitting out, you're just deploying machines or people operating machines for death. I mean, that's really all you're doing. When Nasrallah was, in order to assassinate Nasrallah, they dropped, as I recall, 80 JDAMs on a high rise in Beirut. Now, there was nothing precise about that at all. You might say, well, that they identified where he lived, and so that, maybe based upon intelligence data that they gathered. But the actual conducting of the assassination itself was just a matter of raw power. Having at your disposal, if I'm correct, 80 very expensive, high explosives. Explosives so powerful that you could blow up an entire neighborhood with certainly one or two of them, right? 80, if I'm remembering correctly, into this building. So they wanted to be sure, as if they were trying to kill Zeus or something, that the target was destroyed, and they didn't care, and that the entire building was pulverized in the process, and they didn't care who else died. So the precision of identifying where he um, was nullified by the fact that they didn't care who died, on a mass scale. And so I think that's where we are. Just as I think we'll see other forms of state repression take wider and wider circles. You start. It always starts this way, right? With whoever is supposed to be targeted, but then the machine needs to be fed. The machine of repression needs to be fed. It needs more victims. It's not as if once it's done with the initial targets that they're done. ICE isn't going anywhere. They just have to have somebody else to harass. Um, and so it could be, just yeah, it could be like a lady whose baby is crying at some point, and even a white person. We don't really know, and they'll have data to back it up. To their indiscriminate actions. They're increasingly indiscriminate actions. So I suspect that, to your earlier point, that maybe obscuring culpability, obscuring guilt might have been one of the ideas, but I think that idea was abandoned long, long, long ago, and now it's just now they just have maybe confirmation lists, perhaps, of who they have killed.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think with the Nasrallah, it actually was they took out a whole block to get the bunker, right,
Yes,
under,
yeah,
because it was an underground meeting, I think, that
yeah,
they
yeah,
alleged
yeah.
was, I mean,
Yeah,
that's at
because
least
with that
my.
with that many high explosive ordnance, yeah, you would take out an entire block. Yeah. So so yeah, I mean that is so the chain that we showed earlier, I think is relevant, but on the action end, I think people need to understand that what we're seeing and what we're going to see probably more and more of is not, as in a movie, well, the laser, got the one person. We're just going to see an entire neighborhood, an entire block, destroyed because the one person happened to be there, or because they wanted to destroy everybody, in the neighborhood.
Yeah, which reminds, I mean, we both have a Philly connection. It reminds
Mm.
me of the Move bombing in
Absolutely,
1985, you know,
absolutely. Like
took out
how much
40
damage?
homes.
How much damage was going to be done? Well, the people who dropped, I believe it was like C4. I mean, imagine. I remember when I first read that report. I'm like, What are you talking about? You dropped C4 on a house on a row? What? You weren't trying to destroy a tank, right? But that just shows the fact that they didn't care, and the mindset, which is found all throughout. And one of the things I also want people to understand is that these ideas are universal throughout the political economy of this global system. It's not as if, oh, well, the Australian government doesn't think this way, or or whoever. No, no, they all think this way. This is who you're dealing with globally, right? And so yeah, we do need to adjust our understanding accordingly.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I mean, we released an audio episode yesterday with Joe Emmersberger, and we were
Hmm.
talking about Venezuela and
Yes.
these, blowing up these boats off of the coast of Venezuela,
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
claiming that they're, drug trafficking, right? Which is just like the wildest.
It's absurd,
It's
and
it's
and
it,
um and you know and I mean I don't know anything about what they did or how they identified their targets, whether they're just patrolling the waters and just destroying whatever and then making wild claims. But but as I said, I mean I wouldn't be surprised if say Microsoft or one of these companies is involved, because the Pentagon is using their platforms, for war fighting, as they call it, the warrior, for for these actions. Um, Now, the fact that they're now the United States has turned its attention to its own hemisphere in this way, I think also suggests that the decline that many of us have been talking about is a bit more precipitous than people believe, because you see the United States withdrawing from its global commitments, and becoming more of a menace to its own hemisphere. And I think that uh, this is getting back to computation. This also makes understanding these systems and then developing countermeasures even more urgent, because as the United States withdraws from its global footprint, of necessity, because maintaining 800 bases is becoming untenable. And the current regime, just doesn't have the capacity to manage a global empire. I mean, we're not talking about Eisenhower here, right? So I think they will turn more and more and more to the use of these systems to try to repress the population of an increasingly restless population, and an increasingly restless region, that had some respite, a little bit of respite. Not respite's the wrong word, but when the U.S. was turning its attention to China and other things, then there wasn't so much of a focus. Certainly, there wasn't this level of attack, like this blatant type of attack. Certainly, dirty tricks. But now that the U.S. realizes, and I believe there was a report from the Pentagon, maybe Hexeth, but certainly someone who said that they now realize that China is impossible for the United States. I think I said to someone recently, if you can't defeat Yemen, you're not going to defeat China. I'm sorry. I'm just sorry. And the recent Chinese parade, I think was a demonstration that probably got them all really having to change their underwear. It was like, holy shit.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, and I mean, speaking of Hegseth and Trump, that we were talking before we started about their,
Hmm.
their little meeting with the generals yesterday or whatever,
Mm,
and
mm.
one of the things that they did discuss was the deployment of American troops into U.S. cities. Not
Yes,
saying not just the National Guard, but also
yes.
we need you all
Actual
there.
combat trained troops, and I think that computation is going to increasingly play a role, well, an increasing role, an expanding role of repression within the domestic U.S. As the U.S. Returns to its 19th century, how would I put this, mode of being and mode of action, which people who don't know a great deal about U.S. history mistake what I call the technocratic era, which began in with World War II with FDR, building up an actual state apparatus to fight the war, and then realizing, that you needed an apparatus to wage a Cold War under Truman, an apparatus that was maintained for decades, which has now fallen apart because it doesn't have an actual adversary, and you now have a generation or two of people who don't have the necessary skills to maintain such an empire as it retreats to itself, to its hemisphere. These AI dreams become more feverish. In our first conversation, you asked me if I thought that the delusion, the dream was that they could destroy labor in the U.S., such as immigrant labor and so forth, and replace it with AI. And I think that yes, that is exactly what they believe. It is a false hope, and it will be dashed, which will, when people's hopes are dashed, they tend to get even nuttier rather than adjusting their understanding accordingly, particularly these kinds of psychopaths.
Yeah. No, absolutely appreciated. Dwayne, I know that we want to kind of wind down here.
Hmm.
One of the things I wanted to ask, since you have it in your little name there, is if you wanted to say something about the journal
Yeah,
here.
it's a literary journal that I started with some friends. But the idea of this journal is that we're looking for writers, people who want to write about real things, like materialist writing, right? Something like, for example, when it comes to various topics, we hear a lot from academics, which is great. We hear sometimes from journalists, at least journalists who are good. But what my co-editors and I want to hear from are people who are doing things in the world. Like if you are a nurse and things are happening in nursing, we want to hear from you. Whatever it is you're doing, if you don't have a job, it doesn't matter. Whatever it is you're doing, and you're thinking about the world, and you're wrestling with it, and you're trying to share your knowledge, because I think that there's a wealth of knowledge out there that's not getting out to the world. I started my blog because, as we talked about in the first our first conversation, because I wasn't hearing from people with a Marxist perspective who actually had worked in this industry. And you don't have to be a Marxist to for us to publish you, but you do have to be a materialist in whatever sense, right? So yeah, please visit, please write. We want to promote the thoughts uh, of people doing real things.
Appreciate it, and I agree with you. I mean, I think we need a lot. Um, it's one of those. Actually, it's a debate or something that we get into sometimes, of like, do we actually need more people, on the left doing media work or doing journalism, or what? Because certainly we need better organizations, more
Hmm.
organizations, like all of those
Hmm.
things. And so sometimes it can be a thing where we have this analysis, which I think on the whole I actually agree with, which is that
Hmm.
we're maybe a little bit too in operating a little too much in a kind of cultural ideas sphere, and not
Hmm.
enough in the, like, okay, how do we get together, organize,
Yeah.
groups, and actually figure out how we're going to act in certain ways. Having said that, I still think that we still need more people, you know, like you're saying, especially analysis that is about
Yeah.
things that people have a deep, they have a personal connection
Yeah.
to. They know a lot about it. They've spent, a good
Yeah.
amount of time in it. They know what they're talking about, but also
Yes.
they have a good analysis that's
A
grounded
good
in
analysis. I mean, I've learned so much. For example, I consulted years ago for the power company there in Philly, Exelon, right? And I learned a great deal about the national grid from a guy who had, as it happens, I think it was LiveJournal at the time or something. But anyway, he was writing. He was writing about the U.S. power grid, which he just knew intimately. And he was, he didn't have our political commitments, but he was an honest, clear thinking person. So he could see contradictions, he could see lies. And I really appreciated him, and I got to work with him, which was beautiful. And he was retired, and then because he had so much knowledge, and like he was 70, and they called him back because no one seemed to know the power grid the way he did. We called him the Monsignor because he had a beautiful head of hair and looked like he was a priest or something. And but anyway, there are millions of people like this. There are people who will work at a McDonald's but understand like how McDonald's functions and what it is at a corporate level. Yeah, these people aren't being heard from. They're just not being heard from. They may be interviewed by an academic, and then the academic will write the thing, and that's great. We need scholars focusing on things. They have the time and the energy. But yeah, I want to encourage people to believe that they can do it, and I'm here. We're here to encourage you and to help you.
That's awesome. Well, I encourage people to check that out and also to reach out. I already saw Chidi Macha say that she has a piece in mind, and she's a great writer with
Oh,
a
that's
good
fantastic.
analysis. So
Fantastic.
that would be great. So,
Yeah.
all right. Thanks again, Dwayne. This was
Yeah.
good. I know that it won't be too long before we do it again. Always good to be in conversation with you.
Yeah,
We
same
do
here.
have, just so folks know, we are in talks, I guess we could say, about Imperial 80s episodes and some other future collaborations. So
Mhm.
we will figure that out in due time. But yeah, in the meantime, also make sure to check out Monday. Renee Johnston's going to be back, and we're going to do A Nightmare on Elm Street, which I'm looking forward to discussing. I'm looking forward to horror movies over October. So,
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
anyway, there's lots of, I think it's that there's a lot of real world horror right now. And
Yeah,
so,
this is why horror
like,
movies. I'm having a hard time with horror movies for this reason. Because we've just seen so many horrifying things, and like I'm having a hard time. Although horror is a genre I've always had an interest in, but yeah, it's a little tough, at least for me right now.
yeah, there's nothing as horrific as reality right
As
now,
life
probably.
itself, yeah.
Yeah. All right, Dwayne, thank you so much again.
All right, bye.